The question wasn't whether they were masters. It was whether masters could learn to share the same sky. The Los Angeles County Fair, summer of 1973, two circus troupes at the absolute peak of their powers, forced by circumstance to occupy the same performance space, the Sky Masters, whose aerial artistry had redefined what the human body could achieve in flight, the Ground Kings, whose earthbound strength had shattered every conception of physical limits. Each group had spent years perfecting their craft, believing their approach was the only true path to circus mastery. But when ego met ego at 30 feet above ground, when pride collided with pride in the sawdust below, something explosive was bound to happen. The first accident seemed innocent enough, a silk ribbon that snapped during practice, sending an aerialist tumbling into the safety net. The second incident raised suspicions. Ground equipment mysteriously repositioned just before a pyramid formation. By the third mishap, it was clear that these weren't accidents at all. Bruce Lee had been watching from the beginning, brought in to add martial arts demonstrations to the fair's entertainment lineup. But what he witnessed wasn't just professional jealousy. It was a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of mastery itself. Masters, Bruce Lee would tell them, are not made by what they can do alone, but by what they can create together. How would this simple truth transform two groups of individual masters into something far greater than either could achieve alone? And what would the audience witness when these rivals finally understood that the greatest art comes not from competition, but from collaboration? It was June 15, 1973, when the Los Angeles County Fair made what seemed like a brilliant decision. For the first time in the fair's history, they would feature not one, but two world-class circus troupes performing in the same venue. The idea was simple: combine the ethereal beauty of aerial performance with the raw power of ground-based circus arts to create the most spectacular entertainment experience California had ever seen. The Sky Masters had earned their reputation across 3 continents, led by Maria Castellanos, a Spanish aerialist whose grace on the silks had been compared to poetry written in motion. The troupe consisted of 8 performers who had revolutionized aerial arts. They performed on silks, lyra hoops, and trapeze with a fluidity that made the impossible look effortless. When Maria performed her signature move, a 40-foot drop caught by nothing but a silk wrapped around her ankle, audiences held their breath in perfect silence before erupting in thunderous applause. The Ground Kings represented everything traditional and powerful about circus performance. Viktor Petrov, a Russian strongman whose family had been circus performers for 4 generations, led a team of 12 artists who could build human pyramids 4 stories high, bend iron bars with their bare hands, and perform acrobatic sequences that defied every law of physics. When Viktor's team performed their signature pyramid, 12 men balanced in perfect formation while juggling flaming torches. The ground itself seemed to tremble with their collective power. Both troupes were, undeniably, masters of their craft. And therein lay the problem. The Sky Masters viewed their art as the evolution of circus performance, elegant, sophisticated, requiring years of training to achieve the perfect balance of strength, flexibility, and artistic expression. They looked at ground-based performances as relics of a bygone era, impressive perhaps, but lacking the transcendent beauty that came from defying gravity itself. Ground performers are certainly strong, Maria had said during their first day of rehearsals, watching Victor's team practice their formations. But strength without grace is just brutish. Circus should elevate the soul, not just demonstrate physical power. The Ground Kings, for their part, viewed aerial work as show-off artistry that had lost touch with the roots of circus tradition. They respected the skill required, but questioned whether it represented the heart and soul of what circus was meant to be. Those aerial artists float around looking pretty, Victor had muttered to his team as they watched the Sky Masters rehearse. But circus is about connection with the audience, about making them feel the earth shake with what human beings can accomplish together. You can't build that kind of energy from 30 feet in the air. The tension between the two groups had been palpable from the moment they shared the same rehearsal space. The Sky Masters required absolute silence and concentration for their aerial work. One moment of distraction at height could mean serious injury or death. The Ground Kings' training involved loud calls, rhythmic chanting, and the kind of explosive energy that built momentum for their powerful displays. Neither group was willing to compromise their rehearsal needs for the other. The fair organizers had anticipated some friction and had attempted to create a schedule that would allow each troupe separate rehearsal times. But with only 2 weeks to prepare for the opening gala, and with both groups needing extensive technical setup time, conflicts were inevitable. It started small. The Sky Masters would arrive for their scheduled rehearsal time to find that the Ground Kings had left their equipment scattered around the rigging points. The ground kings would discover that their carefully positioned mats and platforms had been moved to accommodate the aerial setup. These minor inconveniences quickly escalated into pointed comments, cold shoulders, and an atmosphere of mutual resentment. Bruce Lee had been contracted to provide martial arts demonstrations during the intermissions between circus acts. His role was meant to be simple: showcase some basic kung fu forms, maybe break a few boards, give the audience a brief cultural experience that complemented the international flavor of the circus performances. But from his position on the sidelines, Bruce Lee was observing something far more complex than professional rivalry. He was watching two groups of extraordinarily talented individuals destroy their own potential through a fundamental misunderstanding of what made their art powerful. The first serious incident occurred on June 20th, 5 days into rehearsals. Maria Castellanos was practicing a complex silk routine that required her to climb 40 feet above the ground, execute a series of spins and drops, and conclude with a dramatic pose that left her suspended upside down just 10 feet above the audience seating area. As she reached the climax of her routine, the silk ribbon suddenly snapped. Maria plummeted toward the ground, managing to grab a secondary line that broke her fall and sent her tumbling into the safety net below. She was shaken but uninjured, but the incident brought rehearsals to a complete halt. Examination of the silk revealed that it had been cut, not completely severed, which would have been immediately obvious, but strategically weakened so that it would fail under the stress of performance. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the equipment. Accusations flew immediately. The Sky Masters pointed out that only someone familiar with aerial rigging would know exactly where to cut a silk to make it fail at the moment of maximum stress. The Ground Kings countered that anyone with basic knowledge of textiles and tension could have figured out the weak points. More importantly, they argued, why would they sabotage equipment that could have killed someone? Their rivalry was professional, not murderous. The fair director, James Morrison, called an emergency meeting. "I don't care who did what to whom," he said bluntly. "If there's one more incident, one more, both troops are fired and replaced. I've got insurance companies breathing down my neck and 3,000 people expecting the show of their lives in 9 days. Figure it out." But the incidents didn't stop. 3 days later, just as Victor's team was preparing to practice their signature 4-story pyramid, they discovered that their foundation mats had been soaked with a slippery substance that made secure footing impossible. The following day, the Sky Masters found that their aerial points had been loosened just enough to make them unsafe for full-weight practice. The sabotage was escalating, and both sides were convinced the other was responsible. What had started as professional rivalry was becoming something dangerous. That's when Bruce Lee decided to intervene. His first conversation was with Maria Castellanos. He found her in the small practice area she had set up behind the main tent, working through meditation exercises that helped her center herself before aerial practice. "Miss Castellanos," Bruce Lee said, approaching with the respectful bow he offered to all fellow artists. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to speak with you about what happened with your silk." Maria looked up, surprised. She had seen Bruce Lee around the rehearsal area but hadn't expected him to take an interest in the circus performers' problems. "It's frightening," she admitted. "When you're 40 feet up, you have to trust your equipment completely. If someone is deliberately trying to hurt us..." She shuddered at the thought. "May I ask you something?" Bruce Lee said gently. "When you perform aerial work, what is the source of your power?" Maria considered the question carefully. "Balance," she said finally. "It's all about finding the perfect balance between strength and surrender, between controlling the silk and allowing it to support you. When I'm performing well, I'm not fighting the equipment or fighting gravity, I'm dancing with them." Bruce Lee nodded thoughtfully. "And when you watch the Ground Kings perform, what do you see?" "Impressive strength," Maria replied, though her tone suggested this was a concession rather than genuine admiration. "But it seems so forceful. So much effort and strain. Where's the artistry in that?" "What if I told you," Bruce Lee said, "that Victor's pyramid work requires exactly the same balance you described. Each person in that formation must find the perfect point between strength and surrender, between supporting others and being supported. They're dancing with physics just as you dance with gravity." Maria looked skeptical. "But it looks so different, so earthbound. Water flowing down a mountain and water flowing across a plain look very different," Bruce Lee observed. "But they're both water, following the same fundamental principles. The mountain stream isn't more pure than the river just because it moves faster." He paused, watching Maria's expression as she processed this idea. "Your aerial work and their ground formations," Bruce Lee continued, "are both expressions of the same thing. Human beings finding ways to transcend their individual limitations by working in harmony with forces greater than themselves. You use gravity and silk. They use balance and collective strength. The source is the same." That evening, Bruce Lee had a similar conversation with Viktor Petrov. He found the strongman in the equipment area, meticulously checking every piece of his team's gear for signs of tampering. "Mr. Petrov," Bruce Lee said, "I understand you're concerned about your team's safety." Viktor looked up from the mat he was examining. "Someone is trying to hurt us. My team depends on absolute trust. One person loses confidence, the whole pyramid fails. These incidents are destroying that trust." "When your team builds their formations," Bruce Lee asked, "what makes them strong?" "Foundation," Viktor replied immediately. "Everything starts with the foundation. The base has to be absolutely solid, perfectly balanced. Then each level builds on that foundation, each person supporting and being supported. It's like architecture made of human bodies. And when you watch the aerial performers, what do you see?" Viktor's expression hardened slightly. "Impressive, yes, but it's all individual showmanship. Where's the team effort? Where's the connection to tradition?" "What if I told you," Bruce Lee said, "that Maria's aerial work requires exactly the same foundation you described? She must have perfect physical foundation, core strength, flexibility, absolute body control, and she must have complete trust in her equipment, in her training, in her ability to find support even when she's seemingly suspended in empty air." Viktor looked puzzled. "But she's up there alone. There's no team support, is she?" Bruce Lee asked. "Who rigged her silks? Who trained her in technique? Who ensures her safety equipment is properly maintained? Every time she performs, she's supported by an entire team of people. You just can't see them because they're not on stage with her." Bruce Lee gestured toward the main tent where both troops were setting up for the next day's rehearsal. "Your ground formations and her aerial work are both expressions of the same thing. Human beings finding ways to achieve the impossible by building on solid foundations and trusting in support systems. You use visible teamwork. She uses invisible teamwork. The principle is the same." Over the next several days, Bruce Lee continued these conversations with other members of both troops. He spoke with aerial artist Carlos about the physics of silkwork, demonstrating how the principles were similar to the leverage techniques used in martial arts. He talked with ground performer Nina about the flow and rhythm required for successful pyramid building, showing her how it paralleled the flow states that Maria achieved in her aerial meditation. Gradually, he began to plant seeds of understanding, but the sabotage incidents continued, and tensions were reaching a breaking point. The crisis came to a head on June 28th, just 2 days before the opening gala. Viktor's team was practicing their most ambitious routine, a 4-story human pyramid that would be built while all 12 members juggled flaming torches. It was dangerous under the best of circumstances, requiring split-second timing and absolute trust among all participants. As they reached the final formation, with Viktor himself at the apex holding 4 torches while balanced on the shoulders of 11 teammates, the base support suddenly collapsed, not due to any failure of strength or technique, but because someone had scattered ball bearings under the foundation mats. The entire formation came crashing down, with flaming torches scattering across the rehearsal area. Miraculously, no one was seriously injured. Circus performers are trained to fall safely, but several team members suffered burns and bruises, and the psychological impact was devastating. Viktor's team, whose entire art form depended on unshakable trust, no longer trusted their environment. The fair director called an emergency meeting for the entire production. "That's it," James Morrison announced to both troops, the technical crew, and Bruce Lee. "I've had enough. Both circus acts are fired, effective immediately. I'm bringing in replacement acts for the opening gala. Clear your equipment out by tomorrow morning." The announcement hit both groups like a physical blow. For professional circus performers, being fired from a major venue meant more than just lost income. It meant damage to their reputations that could affect their ability to book future performances. Word of failure spread quickly in the tight-knit circus community. As the meeting broke up, both troops began the dejected process of packing their equipment. The mood was somber, with members of both groups sitting in small clusters, processing the reality that weeks of preparation had come to nothing. That's when Bruce Lee stood up and addressed both groups together for the first time. "Before you pack," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the rehearsal space, "I want to share something with you. For the past week, I've been watching both of your groups, and I've seen something remarkable. I've seen artists who have achieved mastery in their chosen disciplines, but I've also seen artists who have forgotten something essential about the nature of mastery itself." He walked to the center of the space, positioning himself between the two groups. "Maria," he said, "when you perform your aerial work, where does your power come from?" "From balance," Maria replied, though her voice was subdued. "From finding harmony between opposing forces." "Viktor," Bruce Lee continued, "when your team builds their formations, what makes them strong? Foundation and trust. Victor answered. Each person supporting the others. Both of you are correct, Bruce Lee said, and both of you have been demonstrating exactly the opposite of your own principles. You've been fighting instead of finding balance. You've been undermining instead of building foundation. You've been destroying trust instead of creating it. He paused, looking from one group to the other. I've been thinking about who might be responsible for the sabotage, Bruce Lee continued, and I've realized something. It doesn't matter whether someone from the Sky Masters has been undermining the Ground Kings, or someone from the Ground Kings has been sabotaging the Sky Masters, or whether some outside person has been playing both groups against each other. The result has been the same. You've allowed competition to destroy collaboration. Maria stood up, her face flushed with anger. Are you saying this is our fault? Someone has been trying to hurt us. I'm saying, Bruce Lee replied calmly, that you've been so focused on proving your superiority that you've made yourselves vulnerable to manipulation. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and both of your groups have been actively dividing this house. Victor stepped forward. What would you have us do? Ignore attacks on our safety? I would have you remember what you know about mastery, Bruce Lee said. In martial arts we have a principle. The best way to defeat an enemy is to turn them into an ally. The second best way is to avoid the fight altogether. The worst way is to engage in a battle that destroys everything you're trying to protect. He gestured toward the equipment that both groups had begun packing. Look around you. Both of your groups are masters of your respective arts. Both of you have developed techniques and skills that represent years of dedicated practice. Both of you have something unique and valuable to offer, and both of you are about to lose the opportunity to share those gifts with the world because you couldn't see past your own pride. Bruce Lee walked over to a silk that had been left hanging from the rigging, then moved to examine one of the foundation mats that Victor's team used for their formations. Maria, your aerial work requires these silks to support your full weight while you move through complex patterns 30 feet above the ground. Victor, your formations require these mats to provide stable foundation while 12 people balance in perfect coordination. Both of you are literally trusting your lives to equipment and techniques that allow you to achieve things that would be impossible alone. He looked up at both groups. What if, instead of competing, you collaborated? What if the Sky Master's knowledge of rigging and aerial physics could make the Ground King's formations even more stable? What if the Ground King's understanding of foundation and teamwork could make the Sky Master's individual performances even more secure? The suggestion was met with skeptical silence from both groups. The idea of collaboration seemed impossible after days of mistrust and sabotage. I don't see how that would work, Maria said finally. Our approaches are completely different. Aerial work requires silence and concentration. Ground formations need energy and communication. Water is silent when it flows smoothly, Bruce Lee replied, but it can also roar when it needs to move obstacles. The silence and the sound both serve the same purpose, allowing the water to reach its destination. He walked to the center of the space again. I propose an experiment. Give me 1 hour tomorrow morning, 1 hour before you finish packing and leave. Let me show you something about the connection between your two art forms. If I'm wrong, you lose nothing but an hour. If I'm right, you might discover something that transforms both of your approaches to performance. The members of both groups looked at each other uncertainly. After days of conflict, the idea of working together seemed almost absurd, but they were facing the end of this opportunity anyway. What did they have to lose? 1 hour, Victor said finally. But if this doesn't work, we're done. Agreed, Maria added, but I don't see how you can bridge such different approaches. Trust the process, Bruce Lee said simply. That's all I ask. The next morning, June 29th, both groups gathered in the rehearsal space with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. Bruce Lee had spent the early morning setting up a series of simple exercises that he hoped would demonstrate the connections he had been describing. We're going to start with something very basic, Bruce Lee announced. I want 3 volunteers from each group. Maria, Carlos, and 1 other from the Sky Masters. Victor, Nina, and 1 other from the Ground Kings. The 6 volunteers stepped forward, still maintaining the invisible barrier that had separated the 2 groups for the past 2 weeks. Maria, Bruce Lee said, I want you to demonstrate your basic silk climb. Nothing fancy, just the fundamental technique for gaining height safely. Maria approached the silk and began her climb. Her technique was flawless, each movement efficient and controlled, her body maintaining perfect alignment as she ascended smoothly to about 15 feet above the ground. Beautiful, Bruce Lee said. Now Victor, I want you to describe what you observed about Maria's technique. Victor looked uncomfortable. I don't know much about aerial work. Don't think about it as aerial work, Bruce Lee said. Think about it as movement and balance. What did you see? Victor studied Maria, who was still suspended on the silk. Her core is completely stable. Even though she's moving, her center never shifts unnecessarily, and she's using her whole body, Legs, arms, core, everything working together. Exactly, Bruce Lee said. Maria, what Victor just described, core stability, efficient movement, total body coordination, how does that relate to your art? Those are the fundamentals, Maria admitted. Without those basics, nothing else is possible. Victor, Bruce Lee continued, show us the beginning of your basic pyramid formation, just the foundation level. Victor called 2 of his teammates to join him, and together they formed the triangular base that supported all of their more complex formations. Their positioning was precise, each person's balance contributing to the stability of the whole structure. Maria, Bruce Lee said, describe what you observe about Victor's technique. Maria studied the formation. Each person is perfectly balanced individually, but they're also creating balance together. And their foundation points, the way they're positioned, it's like the rigging points for aerial work. Each connection has to be exactly right or the whole thing fails. What else? Bruce Lee prompted. The trust, Maria said, her voice gaining interest. Each person has to trust that the others will maintain their position. It's like trusting your equipment, but the equipment is other people. Bruce Lee smiled. Both of you just described the same fundamental principles using different words. Stability, efficiency, precision, trust, foundation. These aren't concepts that belong to one art form or another. These are the building blocks of all mastery. He positioned himself between the aerial silk where Maria was suspended and the ground formation where Victor's team was positioned. Now I want to try something, Bruce Lee said. Victor, can your formation support additional weight if it's properly distributed? Yes, Victor replied, but only if the weight is balanced correctly. Maria, can you lower yourself from the silk in a controlled descent? Of course, Maria said. What if, Bruce Lee suggested, Maria descended from the silk to a position where she could become part of Victor's formation, not landing on the ground, but transitioning from aerial support to human support. Both groups looked puzzled by the suggestion. It had never occurred to any of them that aerial and groundwork could be combined in a single sequence. I don't understand, Maria said. How would that work? Show me, Bruce Lee said. Victor, extend your formation to create a connection point about 8 feet off the ground. Maria, descend slowly and see if you can transition from the silk to that connection point. What happened next was hesitant, experimental, and absolutely revolutionary. Maria began lowering herself from the silk, while Victor's team adjusted their formation to create a stable platform at the height where she would arrive. The process required constant communication between both sides, Maria calling down information about her descent speed and position, Victor's team coordinating to ensure they could safely support her arrival. When Maria finally made contact with the extended formation, becoming part of a hybrid structure that was part aerial work and part human pyramid, something magical happened. The combination created visual lines and possibilities that neither art form could achieve alone. My God, whispered Carlos, one of the aerial artists who had been watching from the side. Look at the geometry of that formation. It's like architectural sculpture, breathed Nina, one of the ground performers. But it moves. Bruce Lee allowed them to hold the combined position for a moment, then asked them to carefully reverse the process, with Maria transitioning back to the silk while Victor's team returned to their standard formation. When both groups had returned to their starting positions, the rehearsal space was filled with excited chatter. For the first time in 2 weeks, members of both troupes were talking to each other instead of past each other. That was incredible, Maria said, her earlier skepticism replaced by genuine enthusiasm. I've never felt that kind of support during a transition. The stability was perfect, Victor added. Having an aerial element added to the formation created balance points we'd never considered. Bruce Lee gathered both groups together. What you just experienced, he said, is what happens when masters collaborate instead of compete. You didn't lose anything that made your individual art form special. Maria's aerial work was still beautiful and precise. Victor's formation was still strong and stable, but together you created something that neither could achieve alone. He paused, watching their faces as they processed what had just happened. This is what I mean when I say that mastery is not about what you can do alone, but about what you can create together. Your individual skills become more powerful when they're combined with other masters' skills, not less powerful. Over the next 30 minutes, Bruce Lee guided both groups through a series of exercises that explored different ways aerial and groundwork could be integrated. They discovered that aerial artists could use human formations as dynamic rigging points, allowing for movements and transitions that were impossible with static equipment. They found that ground formations could incorporate aerial elements to create visual lines and dramatic possibilities that added new dimensions to traditional pyramids and group choreography. Most importantly, they discovered that working together required them to become better at their individual specialties, not worse. The aerial artists had to be more precise with their movements and timing to coordinate with ground-based partners. The ground performers had to be more stable and communicative to provide reliable support for aerial transitions. As the hour-long session came to an end, the atmosphere in the rehearsal space had completely transformed. Instead of two separate groups defending their territories, there was now one group of artists excited about new possibilities. "This changes everything," Maria said to Bruce Lee, "but we're still fired. The opening gala is tomorrow night, and we don't have time to create a complete show using these techniques." "Actually," Bruce Lee replied, "you do. You already have complete shows, 2 of them. What you need now is a way to combine them that showcases both approaches while creating something new." He walked to the whiteboard that the technical crew used for scheduling and began sketching a simple diagram. "What if your opening gala performance was structured as a conversation between Earth and sky?" Victor's team begins with a ground-based sequence that establishes the power and tradition of circus performance. Maria's team responds with an aerial sequence that shows the evolution and artistry of modern circus. Then, for the finale, you combine both approaches in a collaborative sequence that demonstrates the synthesis of tradition and innovation. The groups gathered around the whiteboard as Bruce Lee outlined his vision. "The story you're telling," he continued, "is the story of how apparent opposites can actually be complementary forces. Your audience will see that ground-based and aerial work aren't competing philosophies. They're different expressions of the same human desire to transcend individual limitations through art." Victor studied the diagram. The technical requirements would be complex. We'd need to coordinate rigging points with formation bases, timing aerial sequences with ground transitions, which means, Maria added, that we'd have to trust each other completely. No more sabotage, no more competition, no more territorial behavior. Bruce Lee nodded. "Trust is the foundation of all mastery. In martial arts, in circus arts, in any collaboration between human beings, you can't achieve your potential while you're defending against allies." The two groups looked at each other with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The technical challenges would be significant. The time frame was impossibly short. The level of trust required was exactly what had been destroyed over the past 2 weeks. "I have an idea," Nina said suddenly. "What if we approach this the way Bruce described water earlier? Instead of trying to force a perfect integration immediately, what if we allow the collaboration to flow naturally?" "What do you mean?" Carlos asked. "Start with simple connections," Nina explained. "Basic transitions that we know we can execute safely. Then as we build trust and understanding, we can add more complex elements. Like building a pyramid. You establish the foundation first, then add layers as the base becomes more stable." Victor looked around at both groups. It would mean putting aside 2 weeks of anger and suspicion. It would mean admitting that our individual approaches, as masterful as they are, can be improved through collaboration. Maria nodded slowly. It would mean trusting that our former rivals can become our partners. Bruce Lee watched as both groups wrestled with the decision. He could see the excitement in their eyes, but also the fear. After days of conflict, the prospect of vulnerability, which was what true collaboration required, was daunting. "There's something else to consider," Bruce Lee said quietly. "Right now, both of your groups are facing failure. Your individual pursuits of superiority have led to a situation where neither of you gets to perform. Collaboration doesn't just offer the possibility of success, it offers the only possibility of success." The truth of this statement settled over both groups. They were out of options except the one they had been avoiding. "All right," Victor said finally, "let's try it. But if we're going to do this, we do it completely. No holding back, no protecting individual reputations at the expense of the group effort." "Agreed," Maria said. Complete commitment to the collaboration. What followed was the most intensive 24 hours of rehearsal any of them had ever experienced. Working with Bruce Lee as a facilitator and creative advisor, both groups had to rapidly develop not just new technical skills, but new ways of communicating, planning, and executing complex sequences. They discovered that collaboration required a different kind of mastery than individual performance. Each artist had to become fluent, not just in their own specialty, but in understanding how their specialty connected with others. The aerial artists had to learn to read the timing and balance requirements of ground formations. The ground performers had to understand the physics and safety requirements of aerial work. Most challenging of all, they had to learn to trust each other in situations where failure could mean serious injury. When an aerial artist transitioned from silk to human formation, both sides were literally holding each other's safety in their hands. But as they worked through the night, something remarkable happened. The technical challenges that had seemed impossible began to resolve themselves. More importantly, the walls that had separated the two groups began to dissolve. They found themselves sharing not just technical knowledge, but but stories about their training, their fears, their dreams for what circus performance could become. "You know," Maria said during a break in rehearsal, "I spent so much energy trying to prove that aerial work was superior to groundwork that I never really watched what you were doing. Your formations are incredibly beautiful. The precision required is extraordinary." "I was doing the same thing," Victor admitted. "I was so determined to show that traditional circus was more authentic than modern aerial work that I never appreciated the artistry of what you do. The strength and flexibility required for your performances is beyond anything I could achieve." Bruce Lee, who had been watching this conversation unfold, smiled quietly. This was exactly the transformation he had hoped to facilitate. "What you're discovering," he told them, "is that mastery recognizes mastery. When you stop competing and start observing with respect, you begin to see the excellence in approaches that are different from your own." As dawn approached on the day of the opening gala, both groups had managed to create a collaborative performance that was technically sound and artistically ambitious. More importantly, they had created something that neither group could have achieved alone, a synthesis of traditional and modern circus arts that honored both approaches while pointing toward new possibilities. The opening gala performance that evening would become the stuff of circus legend. The show began with Victor's Ground Kings demonstrating the power and precision of traditional circus arts. Their opening sequence featured the entire 12-person team building increasingly complex formations while maintaining perfect synchronization. The audience was captivated by the raw strength and coordination required, and impressed by the obvious years of training that had gone into achieving such mastery. The second section featured Maria's Sky Masters showcasing the ethereal beauty of aerial performance. Their sequence took the audience's breath away as silk artists, lyra performers, and trapeze specialists created moving sculptures in the air, their bodies tracing elegant lines against the backdrop of the circus tent. The grace and artistry were undeniable, representing the evolution of circus performance into high art. But it was the third section, the collaborative finale, that brought the audience to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. The sequence began with both groups positioned at opposite ends of the performance area. Victor's team began building their signature 4-story pyramid while Maria's team began ascending their silks and aerial apparatus. As both groups reached the peak of their individual performances, something unprecedented happened. The aerial artists began descending from their equipment, but instead of landing on the ground, they transitioned onto the human pyramid that Victor's team had created. The pyramid then began to move, slowly, carefully, but unmistakably, across the performance area, carrying the aerial artists to new positions where they could transition back to their silks and apparatus. The audience was watching a moving sculpture that combined human architecture with aerial artistry, traditional circus strength with modern circus grace. But more than that, they were witnessing a demonstration of collaboration that transcended the individual excellence of either group. As the sequence concluded, with all 20 performers positioned in a final formation that incorporated both ground and aerial elements, the circus tent erupted in applause unlike anything the Los Angeles County Fair had ever experienced. Backstage, as both groups celebrated their success, Bruce Lee reflected on what he had witnessed over the past 2 weeks. The transformation had been remarkable, but it hadn't been easy. It had required both groups to let go of their attachment to being right in favor of their commitment to being excellent. "Thank you," Maria said to him, as the performers began to wind down from their adrenaline high. "What you taught us, it wasn't just about circus performance. It was about how to work with other people who are different from us. It was about recognizing that our individual mastery becomes more powerful when we share it, not less powerful," Victor added. "I've been performing circus for 20 years, and tonight was the best show I've ever been part of." Bruce Lee bowed respectfully to both groups. "You taught yourselves," he said. "I simply helped you remember what you already knew about mastery. Masters are not made by what they can do alone, but by what they can create together." The success of the opening gala led to an extended engagement for both troupes. More importantly, it led to a permanent collaboration between the Sky Masters and Ground Kings that would revolutionize circus performance for years to come. Their combined approach became a model for other circus companies around the world. Instead of viewing different performance styles as competing philosophies, the circus community began to explore how different specialties could be integrated to create new possibilities for artistic expression. The story of their transformation became a case study in collaboration, taught in business schools and leadership programs as an example of how apparent competitors can become powerful allies when they focus on shared goals rather than individual superiority. But perhaps the most important impact was on the performers themselves. Both groups had discovered that mastery wasn't just about perfecting individual skills, it was about learning to share those skills in ways that created value for others. Years later, When circus historians looked back on the summer of 1973 at the Los Angeles County Fair, they would mark it as the beginning of a new era in performance art. But for the 20 performers who lived through that transformation, it represented something more personal and profound. Before that summer, Maria would reflect in interviews years later, "I thought being a master meant being the best at what I did. Bruce Lee taught us that being a master means helping others become the best at what they do. The individual excellence doesn't disappear when you collaborate, it multiplies." Victor's perspective was equally transformed. "In my family's tradition, circus was about preserving the old ways, maintaining the techniques that had been passed down for generations. I thought innovation meant abandoning tradition. But working with the Sky Masters taught me that tradition becomes stronger when it evolves, not weaker." The technical innovations that emerged from their collaboration extended far beyond the circus world. The engineering principles they developed for safely combining aerial and ground-based performance influenced the design of stage productions, architectural installations, and even industrial safety systems. Their approach to real-time communication between performers working at different levels and positions became a model for coordination in high-risk professional environments. But the deeper lessons were about human nature and the psychology of excellence. Bruce Lee had recognized something that the performers themselves couldn't see while they were in the midst of their conflict. Their rivalry was actually a form of fear. Both groups were afraid that acknowledging the excellence of the other approach would diminish their own achievements. They were operating from a scarcity mindset that treated mastery as a finite resource that could be depleted if shared. "Fear makes us smaller," Bruce Lee explained to a group of martial arts students several months after the circus collaboration. "When we're afraid that someone else's success threatens our own success, we start defending instead of creating. We start trying to tear others down instead of building ourselves up. Fear turns potential allies into enemies." The transformation he had facilitated wasn't just about resolving a workplace conflict or preventing a performance disaster. It was about helping 20 talented individuals move from a fear-based approach to mastery to a collaboration-based approach to mastery. The moment those performers stopped trying to prove they were better than each other and started trying to create something beautiful together, Bruce Lee continued, their individual abilities actually increased. When you're not spending energy on defense and competition, all that energy becomes available for creativity and growth. This principle would become central to Bruce Lee's own teaching philosophy for the rest of his career. He had always believed that martial arts was about more than fighting techniques. It was about developing the kind of character and wisdom that could transform conflict into cooperation. The circus collaboration had given him a perfect real-world laboratory for demonstrating these principles in action. The story spread throughout the entertainment industry, carried by performers, directors, and producers who had witnessed the transformation or heard about it from colleagues. It became particularly influential in Hollywood, where collaboration between different artistic disciplines was essential for successful filmmaking. Several major directors began incorporating the collaboration principles that Bruce Lee had demonstrated into their own approach to managing creative teams. Instead of encouraging competition between departments, cinematography versus editing, acting versus directing, practical effects versus visual effects, they began looking for ways to help different specialties enhance each other's work. "What Bruce Lee showed us with those circus performers," said director Robert Altman in a 1975 interview, "is that the best creative work happens when everyone is trying to make everyone else look good, not when everyone is trying to look good themselves." This shift in thinking would eventually influence industries far beyond entertainment. Business leaders began studying the circus collaboration as an example of how to manage teams of specialists with different approaches and priorities. The principles were applied in fields ranging from medical teams to engineering projects to software development, but the most profound impact remained on the individuals who had lived through the original transformation. Nina, one of the Ground King's performers, used the experience as inspiration to start a circus school that specifically focused on cross-training between different performance specialties. "We teach aerial artists to understand groundwork, and ground performers to understand aerial work," she explained. "Not because we want everyone to do everything, but because understanding other approaches makes you better at your own approach." Carlos from the Sky Masters became a consultant who helped other circus companies resolve conflicts and develop collaborative approaches to performance. "Every circus company eventually faces the same challenge we faced," he said. "Different groups of specialists who need to work together, but who have different training, different priorities, different ideas about what excellence looks like. The principles Bruce Lee taught us apply everywhere." The technical innovations continued to evolve. By 1975, the Sky Masters and Ground Kings had developed what they called dynamic rigging, a system that allowed aerial points to be supported and moved by human formations rather than static structures. This created possibilities for aerial performance that had never existed before, with silk artists and trapeze performers able to move through three-dimensional space in ways that defied traditional limitations. Their performances became increasingly sophisticated and ambitious. They developed narrative structures that used the interaction between earth and sky elements to tell complex stories. Their shows began to influence other art forms, inspiring choreographers, composers, and visual artists who saw new possibilities for combining different creative disciplines. But perhaps the most important ongoing impact was on how they thought about mastery itself. Before that summer, Victor reflected during the 10th anniversary reunion of the original collaboration. "I thought mastery was about perfection, about being so good at what you did that no one could criticize you or compete with you." Bruce Lee taught us that mastery is actually about connection, about being so secure in your own abilities that you can help other people develop their abilities. This redefinition of mastery had profound implications for how both groups approached their teaching and mentoring. Instead of guarding their techniques as trade secrets, they began sharing their knowledge freely with other performers. Instead of seeing other circus companies as competitors, they began seeing them as part of a larger community dedicated to advancing the art form. The school that Nina established became a model for this new approach to circus education. Students learned not just individual techniques, but how to collaborate with specialists in other disciplines. They studied not just their own art form, but the history and principles of related art forms. Most importantly, they learned to see their individual excellence as part of a larger network of excellence, rather than as an isolated achievement. We teach our students that the goal isn't to be the best aerial artist or the best ground performer, Nina explained to a delegation of international circus educators who visited the school in 1978. The goal is to be the kind of artist who makes everyone around them better. When you achieve that, your own performance naturally reaches levels you never thought possible. This philosophy began to influence circus education around the world. Traditional circus schools, which had typically focused on single disciplines, began incorporating cross-training and collaboration into their curricula. The competitive atmosphere that had historically characterized circus training gave way to a more cooperative approach that emphasized mutual support and shared learning. The psychological insights that Bruce Lee had demonstrated also found applications in therapeutic settings. The collaboration between the Sky Masters and Ground Kings became a case study in conflict resolution, team building, and organizational psychology. The principles were adapted for use in corporate training programs, marriage counseling, and community mediation. What Bruce Lee understood, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist who studied the circus collaboration for her doctoral dissertation, is that most interpersonal conflicts aren't really about the surface issues that people are arguing about. They're about deeper fears: fear of not being valued, fear of not being respected, fear of not being needed. When you address those underlying fears, the surface conflicts often resolve themselves. The approach became known as mastery-based conflict resolution, a method that focused on helping people recognize and appreciate each other's areas of excellence, rather than trying to determine who was right or wrong in their disagreements. By 1980, 7 years after the original collaboration, the Sky Masters and Ground Kings had become one of the most successful and influential circus companies in the world. Their performances were selling out venues across North America and Europe. Their innovations were being studied in universities. Their approach to collaboration was being taught in business schools. But for the original 20 performers, the most meaningful measure of their success wasn't fame or financial achievement. It was the transformation they had experienced in their understanding of what it meant to be excellent. "The summer of 1973 changed how I think about everything," Maria said during a documentary interview about the collaboration. "Not just how I think about circus performance, but how I think about relationships, about learning, about what it means to be successful." Bruce Lee showed us that when you stop defending your territory and start exploring new territory together, you discover capabilities you never knew you had. The documentary, which aired on PBS in 1981, introduced the story to a broader audience and sparked interest in applying the collaboration principles to other fields. Educators began using the circus story as an example of how to help students from different backgrounds work together effectively. Community organizers used it as a model for bringing together diverse groups with different approaches to achieving shared goals. The ripple effects continued to spread. Young performers who had been inspired by the Sky Masters and Ground King story went on to found their own companies based on collaborative principles. Business leaders who had heard Bruce Lee speak about the experience incorporated the lessons into their management philosophy. Teachers who had seen the documentary began experimenting with classroom techniques that emphasized cooperation over competition. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to the transformation that had taken place came in 1985, when the Los Angeles County Fair commissioned a permanent installation to commemorate the collaboration. The installation, designed by a team that included both visual artists and circus performers, featured a sculpture that could only be appreciated when viewed from multiple angles simultaneously, a physical representation of the principle that mastery is enhanced through perspective sharing rather than perspective defending. The plaque beneath the installation bore a simple inscription based on the words Bruce Lee had spoken to the performers 12 years earlier. Masters are not made by what they can do alone, but by what they can create together. For the performers who had lived through that intense summer of 1973, the inscription served as a permanent reminder of the most important lesson they had learned. Excellence wasn't something you achieved and then protected. Excellence was something you developed and then shared, and the more you shared it, the more it grew. As Bruce Lee had demonstrated with quiet wisdom and patient guidance, the greatest mastery comes not from rising above others, but from lifting others up. The circus performers had discovered that when you help others reach their potential, you simultaneously reach potentials within yourself that you never knew existed. The transformation from rivalry to unity hadn't just created better performances, it had created better human beings. And that, more than any standing ovation or critical acclaim, was the true measure of what mastery could accomplish when it was grounded in collaboration rather than competition. The story continues to resonate today, more than 5 decades later, as a testament to the power of choosing cooperation over conflict, of seeing difference as opportunity rather than threat, and of understanding that the highest achievements come not from defeating others, but from helping others achieve their own highest potential. In a world that often seems divided by competition and conflict, the summer of 1973 at the Los Angeles County Fair remains a reminder that masters become greatest not when they stand alone at the top, but when they reach down to help others climb higher. And in doing so, they discover that there is no top, only an endless sky of possibility that can be explored together.